I always thought the brightest, calmest part of the day was mid-morning, when the sun had climbed just high enough to clear the rooftops and spill clean light over my front lawn, and that Saturday was no different at first. I walked out in my red and black checkered flannel shirt with a mug of coffee in one hand and a rake in the other, ready to clean up a few stray branches after a windy week, enjoying the way the sunlight made the grass look almost neon green. My yard was nothing fancy. A small maple tree near the sidewalk, a clean concrete driveway, a couple of garden beds, and a patch of lawn I actually took care of myself. No crews, no landscapers, just me, some tools, and a habit of doing things right. I'd barely started raking when I noticed the first orange cone. It wasn't mine. It was sitting dead center on my lawn, about 6 feet from the sidewalk, perfectly upright, practically glowing in the sun like it was daring me to question it. I frowned and looked around. There were more, two at the corner of the yard, one by the maple, another right next to my front steps. Bright orange cones arranged in a pattern that meant something to someone but definitely not to me. Then I saw the tape. Yellow caution tape strung from cone to cone, forming a loose square around my front yard. And stuck right in the middle of it all, pushed into my grass, was a sign: caution, active construction zone, access restricted by HOA. I stopped dead in my tracks. What the? Mike, my neighbor, came strolling down the sidewalk with his usual cup of black coffee, squinting at the scene. He said, did your house get condemned and no one told you? Apparently my front yard did, I replied. I walked over and read the sign again just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. At the bottom, in smaller print, all work, access, and modifications subject to HOA authorization only. There was even a sloppy logo stamped on it. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered. They labeled your yard a construction site, Mike asked. For what leaves? I didn't request anything, no repairs, no work order, nothing, I said. That's when I heard the familiar rapid-fire patter of heavy, overconfident footsteps on the sidewalk, HOA energy approaching. I turned and unsurprisingly, here came Mark, the HOA president, clipboard hugged tight to his chest, two volunteers trailing behind him with clipboards of their own like lower-ranking soldiers in his personal bureaucracy army. Good, he barked as soon as he saw me. You're out here, we need to discuss your site. My site, I repeated. You mean my lawn, your designated construction zone, he corrected, gesturing grandly at my yard like he was unveiling a public works project. This area is now under HOA control. No, it isn't, I said. This is my front yard, which now functions as a community-regulated zone, he said, jabbing a finger at the sign. As of this morning, your property is temporarily classified as active construction. Mike took a slow sip of coffee. Construction of what? Mark snapped his fingers and one of the volunteers flipped through his clipboard. Hazard mitigation, the volunteer muttered. Yard irregularity, potential erosion. Visual inconsistency. Visual inconsistency, Mark repeated dramatically. Your yard has been flagged as a site of concern. I stared at him. Flagged by who? The HOA inspection committee, he declared. The same committee you created and appointed yourself to, I asked. Yes, he said, not seeing the problem. We have determined this yard requires oversight. Oversight for what? I asked. My grass, for future work, he replied. Work that has not yet begun but may begin at any time. Mike frowned. You mean imaginary work? Mark waved that off. The nature of the construction is not your concern. What matters is the classification. You can't just walk onto my property and declare it a construction zone, I said. We absolutely can, Mark answered. We have a sign, we have cones, we have documentation. He waved a stack of papers like that settled it. You now require HOA approval to perform any activity in this zone. Mowing, raking, planting, sitting, standing, walking, breathing, Mike added. Mark ignored him. Additionally, no vehicles may enter this zone without prior authorization. Deliveries, service trucks, or personal work vehicles are prohibited. I narrowed my eyes. This is about my buddy's truck, isn't it? Yesterday, my friend Dave had swung by in his contractor pickup to drop off some leftover lumber from a job. We unloaded in broad daylight, didn't block traffic, didn't leave a mess. Mark had watched from across the street like I'd parked a crane on his lawn. Commercial vehicles, Mark said now, cannot use driveways as staging areas. Dave parked for 20 minutes, I said. He helped me carry boards, that's it. It sent the wrong message, Mark insisted. The HOA cannot allow residents to give the impression that private property is a work site. I spread my arms. It's an American yard. People fix things, they build things. Not without authorization, he snapped. This neighborhood must present a unified, relaxed appearance. No one wants to live next to a constant project. I'm not running a construction company, I said. I build things for myself and occasionally for friends. Mark pointed at the caution tape. And that is why your yard has been reclassified. Until further notice, it is a controlled zone. One of the volunteers chimed in nervously. We logged it as Zone C, unstable aesthetics. Mike nearly spit out his coffee laughing. Unstable aesthetics. This is not a joke, Mark yelled. Residents have expressed concern. Names, I said. Mark hesitated. They chose to remain anonymous. Mike smirked. So you, Mark glared at him. As HOA president, it is my duty to prevent unsanctioned development. There is no development, I said slowly. Nothing going on. No blueprint, no project. There could be, Mark replied triumphantly. We must regulate potential. You're regulating things that don't exist, I said. That's not regulation, that's paranoia. It is prevention, Mark insisted, and prevention is the highest form of governance. Greg from across the street wandered over, wiping his hands with a rag. What now? He asked. Mike nodded toward the tape. His lawn's a construction zone. Greg frowned. Since when? Since this morning, Mark shot back. And as of now, any planned or ongoing construction-related activity must go through the HOA approval process. There is no construction, I repeated. I'm raking leaves, Mark sniffed. We'll see about that when your truck buddy shows up again. He's not my truck buddy, I said. He's a licensed contractor. For a brief second, something flickered behind Mark's eyes, uncertainty, then calculation. A licensed contractor. Yeah, I said. General contractor, fully insured, permitted. Then he will have no problem complying with our process, Mark said. If he intends to be on this property, he will submit plans to the HOA for review. You're out of your mind, Greg muttered. You don't approve real contractors, the city does. The HOA has its own standards, Mark snapped. And if Mr. Contractor insists on stepping onto this property, he will be subject to MY authority. I slipped my phone from my pocket. Funny you should say that, I replied, dialing a number. Mike grinned. Oh, this is going to be good. Mark frowned. Who are you calling? The contractor, I said. Since you've declared my yard a construction zone, I figured it's only fair you meet the guy who actually knows what one looks like. Mark's posture stiffened, but he didn't back down. Good, he will learn how our community operates. Dave picked up on the second ring, and with the cones glowing in the sun and Mark standing smugly inside my caution tape, I said, Hey man, change of plans. The HOA just turned my front yard into a construction zone. I think you should come see what they've done. I hung up and slid the phone away. Mark sniffed. He will follow my instructions or leave. Mike looked at me. He have any idea who he just challenged? I shook my head. Not yet. Because what Mark didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, was that Dave wasn't just any contractor. He was the one who'd built half the houses in this subdivision before the HOA even existed. And the only thing more solid than the concrete he poured was the stack of permits and documentation he kept on file for all of it. The moment I hung up the phone, the entire mood in the yard shifted, like the sunlight itself brightened in anticipation of what was coming. Because even though Mark still stood there with his chest puffed out and clipboard gripped like a judge's gavel, declaring his imaginary authority over my lawn, the truth was already moving toward him on 4 wheels, and he had no idea how catastrophically outmatched he was. Mike leaned across the fence sipping coffee and said, How long until Dave gets here? And I shrugged, depends if he's already on the road, knowing full well that Dave never dawdled when someone messed with his work or the homes he'd built, and right on cue, a distant rumble echoed from down the street. A low, throaty diesel growl that made Mark's smug posture stiffen just a bit, the volunteers exchanging nervous glances as the sound grew louder and louder. Greg crossed his arms. Sounds big. It always does, I said, as the unmistakable silhouette of Dave's navy blue contractor truck turned the corner, chrome grille glinting in the midday sun like a knight's armor. He pulled up to the curb with perfect precision, engine idling with authority. Out stepped Dave, mid-40s, broad shoulders, thick beard, work boots that had seen more job sites than Mark had seen rulebooks, wearing his standard heavy canvas contractor vest with the logo of his building company embroidered across the chest. He took one look at the cones, the tape, the ridiculous sign, and then at Mark, and the slowest, most entertained smile spread across his face. Well, Dave said, walking up the driveway, somebody's been playing construction again. Mark immediately straightened, thrusting his clipboard out like a shield. You must stop right there. This area is an active construction zone and is under HOA authority. Dave blinked, then blinked again, then looked at me. He's serious. Very, I said, tragically. Dave stepped toward the caution tape and Mark jerked forward, hands up like he was warding off a charging bull. You may not enter this zone without HOA approval. I demand your permits now. Dave's smile widened. You want my permits? Yes, Mark barked. All of them. You are a commercial vehicle operator entering a classified Zone C property. Your documentation is required immediately. Dave's eyebrows rose. Zone C, Mike whispered loudly. That's what they call his brain. Greg snorted. Dave hooked his thumb toward the homes lining the street. You do know, he said calmly to Mark, that I built most of these houses, right? Mark faltered. Just a blink, a crack in the armor. Be built. Yes, Dave repeated, stepping over the caution tape like it was a toddler's toy. These foundations, I poured them. These walls, I framed them. The electrical conduits, the patio footings, the utility trenching me. He pointed at the ground beneath Mark's shoes. Even that sidewalk you're standing on, I built it. Mark's eyes darted wildly. That is irrelevant. I control what happens now, Dave chuckled. No, you don't. Not on a property I constructed with permits your little clipboard army has never even seen. One volunteer weakly offered, Sir, HOA requires all contractors to submit plans. Dave cut him off. HOA doesn't approve structural construction in this county. The city does, and I have every single permit from the day this street existed. He reached into his truck, pulled out a thick binder 3 inches thick, and dropped it onto the top of a cone. It made a solid thunk. Dave said, every inspection, every signature, every approval. Mark's face contorted. I this matter. This is about unauthorized future work. Dave laughed. Future work? Who told you there was future work? He did, Mark shouted, stabbing a finger toward me, by receiving construction materials last week. You mean the cedar boards, Dave said, for his personal use on his own property? Yes, Mark insisted. Commercial deliveries cannot occur without HOA oversight. Dave exhaled through his teeth. You do realize I can park my truck here anytime I want. No, you cannot, Mark screamed. This is a construction zone and I control it. Dave leaned in just slightly. Buddy, you don't control anything. The volunteers shuffled behind him. One whispered, I told you this was a bad idea. Mark whirled around. Traitors, you will follow my orders. Dave turned to me. Did you tell him about the overlay? Mark's face snapped back. WHAT overlay, what are you talking about? I grinned. Dave left out something important. Dave nodded. Yeah, before the HOA existed, the developer granted certain rights to the builders, me included, because this land required heavy equipment access during initial construction. He tapped the sidewalk again. That designation never expired. Legally, this entire street is still registered with conditional access privileges for licensed contractors. Mike nearly dropped his coffee. So you outranked the HOA by a mile, Dave said. Mark's jaw flapped uselessly. No, this is impossible. We have authority. We make the rules, Dave shrugged. Rules don't override land grants, infrastructure codes, or pre-existing easements. Easements? Mark stuttered. What easements? Want me to show you? Dave asked. Without waiting for an answer, he opened the binder to a specific page, an old but clearly scanned document with signatures from the city, the developer, and his contracting company. This, Dave said, holding it out, is the legally recorded easement stating that any contractor involved in original construction maintains priority access for follow-up work, maintenance, or homeowner assistance. That cannot apply now, Mark shouted. This subdivision is complete, Dave shrugged. Still applies. Permanently? No, Mark yelled. The HOA rejects this. Dave leaned down so they were eye level. The HOA doesn't get to reject recorded land agreements. The entire neighborhood let out a collective ooh. Greg muttered, this is better than TV. Mike laughed. Better than pay-per-view. Mark stumbled backward, clutching his clipboard. This is outrageous. Your presence is invalid. This entire operation is invalid. Dave crossed his arms. A presence is authorized by the city and the original builder permits. Your cones, your tape, your sign, all worthless. Mark actually screeched. And oh, you cannot undo an HOA designation. Dave turned slowly and pointed right at the sign in my yard. And you can't designate a construction zone without filing a safety plan, outlining hazard mitigation, posting proper signage, submitting an environmental assessment, and notifying the city. Mark's expression twisted like he'd been struck. What? Dave smirked. You didn't file a single one of those, did you? Mark shook his head violently. I don't need to. I am the HOA. Dave tapped his binder. And I'm the guy who actually builds things. Let me show you what a real construction zone looks like. He raised his hand and signaled to his truck. The second door opened. Another man stepped out, hard hat, clipboard, laser measurer, city logo vest. Mark gasped. Is that? Mike grinned wide. Yep. That's the city building inspector. And Mark suddenly understood one very, very important thing. He hadn't made my yard a construction zone. He had made it a legal violation, one that the real professionals were now going to dismantle him with. The building inspector stepping out of Dave's truck changed the entire temperature of the street. Not literally, because it was still a bright, warm afternoon with sunlight bouncing off every window and mailbox, but socially, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and in every other way that mattered to an HOA tyrant who just realized he had opened a door he absolutely should have kept nailed shut, because the inspector walked toward us with calm authority, clipboard in hand. Reflective vest crisp and official, and behind him Dave stood like a granite pillar, arms crossed, expression amused but razor-sharp, while Mark, clipboard trembling in his fist, froze mid-breath, eyes wide with something between terror and denial. The inspector stopped beside Dave, adjusted his sunglasses, and said, "Which one of you filed the construction zone designation with the city?" His tone wasn't angry, but it carried that unmistakable "I know you messed up" professionalism that only a municipal inspector can get away with. Dave nodded toward Mark. That be him. The inspector turned his head slowly, like a security camera detecting movement, and Mark swallowed so loudly the entire neighborhood seemed to hear it. "Why, you must be mistaken," Mark stammered. "The HOA doesn't need city approval for visual hazard assessments." The inspector raised one eyebrow. "You labeled private property as an active construction site." "Yes," Mark said too quickly. "Because it is one, is it?" the inspector asked. His calmness was dangerous. "Yes," Mark insisted, pointing at my yard. "Look at it, cones, tape, a sign, it's clearly under construction." The inspector stared at him for 3 silent seconds. "Sir, you can't just decorate a yard with cones and call it a construction site." Greg burst out laughing so loudly he had to lean against the fence. Mike lifted his coffee in a mock toast. "Mark's been decorating the whole neighborhood for years." Mark shook his head violently. "This is official, this is a real designation." Then, the inspector said, flipping open his clipboard, "Please provide your filing number." Mark blinked. "My what? Your filing number," the inspector repeated. "Every construction zone in this district must be reported within 24 hours with a hazard assessment, zoning code reference, contractor of record, and intended work description. I need your filing number." I don't have a number," Mark sputtered. "I don't need one, the HOA supersedes all of that." "No," the inspector said flatly. "It doesn't," Dave smirked. "Told you." Mark's face reddened not from heat, just sheer humiliation, and he began flipping frantically through his clipboard as if a magical document would appear, proving he held the same authority as an actual city inspector. But the only papers he had were self-printed violation notices, half-legible paragraphs he wrote at 3 a.m., and 2 copies of bylaws he modified without telling anyone. The inspector waited patiently, which was even worse for Mark. "Where is your work plan?" Work plan." Mark echoed. "Where is your contractor of record?" "Contractor of what? Where is your soil assessment, your utility clearance, your hazard declaration for pedestrian traffic?" Mark made a sound like a squeaky door hinge. "The HOA does not do those." "Then the HOA cannot declare a construction site." Mark looked like the ground under him had caved in. But it looks like a construction site. "Because you made it look like one," the inspector said. "That's actually a violation." "A violation?" Mark squeaked. "Against me?" "Yes," the inspector replied, "against you." The volunteers behind Mark stepped backward, each one suddenly realizing they were standing next to a man who just built a legal bonfire under his own feet. Dave folded his arms tighter. "Told you not to play construction, Mark." The inspector walked the perimeter, stepping over the caution tape and lifting one of the cones. "These cones are regulation size," he said. "Where'd you get them?" Mark hesitated too long. Mike murmured. "Stole them off the main road, didn't he?" The inspector looked up. "Did you take these from a public right-of-way?" "Absolutely not," Mark said, voice cracking. I found them." "Found them where?" the inspector pressed. "Around," Mark said weakly. "Define around." "Around the general area, so the roadway." "No," Mark squealed. "Yes," the inspector corrected, making a note on his form. "Unauthorized removal of municipal safety equipment. Noted." Mark staggered backward like someone had shot him. That's not fair. I was using them for community safety." "By illegally marking a private yard as a construction site without city filing?" the inspector asked. "Yes, no, I mean," noted, the inspector repeated. Mark's composure was evaporating faster than water on hot asphalt. He tried to regain confidence by straightening his shirt and barking, "You can't just walk onto HOA territory and issue whatever THOSEARE." The inspector held up the citation form. "They're violations." "Violations?" "Yes," the inspector said, "filed directly under your name as the individual responsible." You can't do that," Mark whimpered. "The HOA protects me from personal liability," Dave chuckled. "No, it doesn't," the inspector nodded. "No, it does not. In fact, HOA presidents are individually responsible for unauthorized regulatory claims, misuse of safety equipment, and false reporting." Mark's knees nearly buckled. False reporting? You reported a construction site," the inspector said. "There is no construction." "There could have been," Mark cried. "Hypothetical hazards," the inspector replied, "are not grounds for classification." Greg shouted. "Translation, you're busted." The inspector turned to me. "Mr. Hayes, sorry for the inconvenience." "Not your fault," I said. "He does this weekly." The inspector nodded sympathetically. "We'll clear the designation now." He ripped down the caution tape in one long, satisfying pull, tossed it onto the cones, and handed Dave the binder. "You're good to proceed with anything you need," Mark gasped. "No, you cannot override the HOA." The inspector looked directly at him. "I already did." Silence swept the yard like a breeze. The inspector leaned slightly closer. "And unfortunately, this isn't over. A false construction report triggers a full municipal review." Mark's pupils shrank. "A municipal review?" "Yes," the inspector said. "A formal evaluation of the HOA's conduct, authority claims, documentation practices, and misuse of safety protocols." "No," Mark screamed. "No, you cannot audit US." "It's already initiated," the inspector said. "Expect a city letter within the week." Mark let out a noise somewhere between a gasp and a squeal. One volunteer whispered to the other, "We're so fired," but the inspector wasn't done. "And because you attempted to regulate a licensed contractor," he added, nodding at Dave, "the Builders Association will also be notified." Mark staggered backward again. The Builders Association?" Dave smirked. "Oh yeah, they love when someone pretends to be them." "This cannot be happening." Mark wailed, gripping his clipboard like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "I am in charge. I set the rules. I declare the ZONES." The inspector closed his folder. "Not anymore." And in that moment, under the bright afternoon sun, surrounded by neighbors, an actual contractor, and a real city inspector, Mark finally understood something he had never once considered in his entire HOA reign: if you pretend to declare a construction zone, eventually a real contractor will show up and prove you've built nothing but your own destruction. Mark's head, because once the building inspector finished listing the violations, he didn't just walk away. He stepped further into the yard with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 25 years dealing with fraudulent claims, fake contractors, and self-appointed neighborhood tyrants who thought they could regulate construction by printing clip art signs from the internet. The sunlight overhead made everything sharper. The cones looked more ridiculous, the tape more flimsy, the sign more embarrassingly homemade, and Mark's posture more crooked with panic. The inspector stood by my maple tree, scanning the perimeter, jotting notes, and muttering things like unregistered site signage, misappropriated safety equipment, and procedural impersonation, each word hitting Mark like a brick. Dave didn't say much. He didn't need to. Every time Mark looked at him, Dave gave that calm, professional nod contractors give each other when they're silently saying, "This is gonna be fun." Mike leaned on the fence, sipping his coffee like it was a live baseball game. Greg stood beside him, arms folded, grinning like he was watching the world's most satisfying documentary. But Mark was unraveling. "You cannot continue this audit," he shouted, pacing back and forth inside the cones like a zoo animal. "The HOA has a process. Only the HOA can review HOA decisions." The inspector didn't even look up, not when city code is violated. But there was no violation, Mark insisted, voice cracking. "I merely designated an area for preventative compliance." Dave burst out laughing. "Preventative compliance? What does that even mean?" Mark planted his feet. "It means the HOA takes proactive steps to ensure community standards are maintained." "By stealing cones?" the inspector asked. Flinched. "They were community borrowed. So you admit they're municipal property?" "I admit nothing," Mark snapped, "except the fact this area should remain a construction zone until further notice." "You don't get to decide that," the inspector said. "I do," Mark screeched. "This is MY territory," Dave shook his head. "Buddy, nothing here belongs to you, not the street, not the sidewalks, not the landscaping zones, and definitely not the right to declare a construction site." "The HOA can declare whatever it wants," Mark shouted. "No one can stop us." "We just did," the inspector replied. Mark turned to his volunteers. "Back me, UP." They looked at each other and stepped back a full step away from him. Mark stared at them like they'd betrayed him personally. "You cowards, I am your president," one whispered. "Not for long," Mark snapped back. "What did you say?" the inspector interrupted. "Actually, that brings us to the next part." Mark froze mid-breath, clipboard halfway raised. "And next part?" the inspector flipped a page. "Yes, because you impersonated a city-regulated authority and falsely established a construction site, we must determine whether the HOA leadership is qualified to hold decision-making power." "Qualified?" Mark squeaked. "I am beyond qualified," Greg laughed. "Mark, you once fined a guy for painting his fence the same color it already was." "It was the wrong shade," Mark shrieked. "There are rules." "Rules you wrote at 2 a.m. in your garage," Mike said. "These are community standards," Mark insisted. "The HOA depends on MY judgment." "We'll see," the inspector replied. He looked at me. "Mr. Hayes, by any chance do you have photos of your yard before the HOA altered it?" "Plenty," I said, pulling out my phone. "And video," Mark nearly fainted. "V-video?" "Yep," I said. "Doorbell camera caught everything." The inspector reviewed it, nodding. "Excellent. This confirms unauthorized site designation and tampering." Mark shrieked. "You cannot use that footage. It is homeowner property." "So is the yard you illegally taped off," the inspector said. "Next." He turned to Dave. "And you said you have permits predating the HOA?" "Every single one," Dave said, holding up the binder again. The inspector inspected the documents, flipping pages like he was scoring a test. "These are legitimate," he said. "Stamped, approved, recorded." Dave replied. "These houses exist because we built them right." The inspector nodded. "Which means the HOA cannot override established contractor rights." Mark stomped his foot. "The HOA overrides everything. We have authority over aesthetics, conduct, parking, trash bins, and yard presentation." The inspector closed his folder firmly. "You do not have authority over construction or land grants or safety equipment or municipal classifications." Mark deflated like a kicked beach ball. But Dave stepped closer. "Mark, you went after the wrong yard," the inspector added, "and the wrong homeowner." Greg called out, "And the wrong contractor." Mike finished, "And the wrong century." Mark spun in circles. No, you cannot do this to me. I am the backbone of this community." "Back pain maybe," Greg muttered. The inspector lifted a final sheet. "Mr. Rudd, this is a notice of municipal inquiry. Effective immediately, the city is reviewing your conduct as HOA president." "What?" Mark squealed. "You can't review me, I review others." "Not anymore," the inspector said. "Until this inquiry concludes, you must cease issuing new regulations, executing enforcement actions, or altering property conditions." Mark gasped like someone turned off his air supply. "Cease, cease," the inspector repeated. "You are temporarily stripped of HOA enforcement authority." The neighbors erupted in cheers. Greg pumped a fist. Mike shouted, "Finally!" Dave grinned like Christmas came early. But Mark collapsed into a crouch, clutching his clipboard like a teddy bear. This cannot be." "It is," the inspector said, "and the board will be receiving all findings." Mark whimpered. They won't remove me, they caw." Dave smirked. "You sure about that?" "Because everyone knew the HOA board had been waiting years for the perfect reason to oust him. And today he handed them a legal one on a silver platter, and the inspector wasn't finished yet, not even close. The funny thing about watching an HOA tyrant implode in broad daylight is that there's no dramatic soundtrack, no slow-motion effects, no thunderstorm rolling in to match his mood. There's just the simple, relentless brightness of the sun, shining on everyone equally, including the guy who just lost the only power he ever thought he had. And as Mark knelt clutching his clipboard like it could somehow protect him from municipal reality, the inspector slid his forms back into the folder and turned toward the sidewalk just as a dark gray SUV turned the corner and rolled to a stop near the curb. The door opened and out stepped Harold, one of the HOA board members, followed by Lewis and another guy from the architectural committee. All three wore the same expression, a mix of exhaustion and grim resolve that told me this wasn't a social visit. Mark scrambled to his feet. "Harold, Lewis, thank God you're here." Outed running toward them. The city has gone rogue. They are attacking the HOA. They are trying to strip us of our power. Harold held up a hand. Mark, stop. Mark froze mid-sentence. And no, you don't understand. This inspector is overstepping. The inspector calmly held up his badge and folder. I'm doing my job. Your president here declared a false construction site, misused municipal safety equipment, and tried to regulate private property he has no jurisdiction over. Lewis sighed, rubbing his temples. We saw the preliminary report. Mark seized on that. Good, then you know this is a misunderstanding. We also saw the photos, Harold said. The cones, the tape, the sign. Greg called out from the fence. Don't forget the Zone C unstable aesthetics. Mike snorted. Harold continued. We got emails from half the street, Mark. People are tired. Mark's eyes darted between them. Tired of what? I protect THEM. I protect this community from chaos. You create chaos, Lewis replied. You turned a man's yard into a fake construction zone because his friend parked a truck in his driveway. He is a contractor, Mark insisted. Commercial activity must be regulated, Dave stepped forward. I'm licensed, insured, and permitted. I built half this subdivision. The city inspector just confirmed I outrank your cones. Harold looked at Dave. We're aware of his credentials. Then he looked back at Mark. What we're not okay with is you picking fights with people who actually know what they're doing. But the HOA needs strong leadership, Mark shouted. We need to be feared. That's your problem, Lewis said. You think fear is leadership. The inspector cleared his throat. Gentlemen, I'll be forwarding my full report to your board. You'll want to review his behavior carefully. We already have, Harold said. He took a folded document from his folder. We called an emergency board meeting this morning. Mark blinked rapidly. A meeting without me? Yes, Harold said. We had to. That is illegal, Mark screamed. I am the president. I must be present. No, Lewis said calmly. Not when the meeting is about you. The entire yard went silent. Even the birds seemed to quiet down. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. About me? Harold nodded. We've had complaints for years, Mark, about your fines, your surprise inspections. Your made-up rules, but this, he gestured at the cones and tape. This is the last straw. You crossed into legal territory. You dragged the city into it. You risked getting the entire HOA sanctioned. I was protecting our authority, Mark protested. You were abusing it, Harold replied, and now you're costing us. He unfolded the paper and read aloud. Effective immediately by unanimous board vote, Mark Rudd is removed as HOA president. All enforcement powers are revoked. All future actions are subject to board review without his involvement. Mark's knees buckled again. Are removed, he croaked. Why you can't remove me, I am the HOA. You were, Lewis said. Not anymore. Mike cheered. Greg clapped. A few other neighbors who'd been quietly watching from their porches stepped closer, nodding in agreement. The inspector simply said, this will make the municipal review easier, Dave chuckled. And probably quieter. Mark shook his head so hard his clipboard rattled. No, I won't allow this. I dedicated my life to this community. No, Harold said, finally letting his frustration show. You dedicated your life to controlling it. Someone had to, Mark shouted. What would you be without me? Relaxed, Mike called out. Happy, Greg added. Less fine, someone else yelled from down the street. Harold folded the removal notice and held it out. You need to sign this acknowledging receipt. Never, Mark roared. I will appeal. I will rally the residents. They need me, Harold glanced at the crowd. Anyone here want Mark to stay as president? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was condemning. Not a hand raised, not a head nodded. Mark's eyes went glassy. And no one? Dave stepped beside me and said quietly, that's the problem with ruling by fear. Once fear's gone, so are you. The inspector turned to me. Mr. Hayes, for the record, your property is fully in compliance. You're free to use your yard as you wish within normal code. I asked if my contractor friend parks his truck in my driveway. Completely legal, the inspector said. If the HOA gives you trouble again, you call me directly. Dave grinned. And me. And us, Greg shouted, gesturing to the neighbors. And apparently the whole city, Mike added. Even Harold managed a small smile. We're going to rewrite a lot of things, he said, starting with how this HOA functions. Without me, Mark whispered, voice cracking. Yes, Harold said, without you. For a moment, I almost felt bad, almost, but then I remembered the cones, the bogus signs, the endless notices, the threats, the way he'd tried to turn my simple life into his personal fiefdom, and any sympathy I might have had evaporated in the sunlight. Lewis turned toward Mark one last time. Collect your things. Access to HOA accounts, records, and enforcement tools will be cut by the end of the day. You're done. Mark looked smaller somehow as he shuffled away, cones and tape fluttering in the breeze behind him like the remnants of a failed regime. No one followed, no one thanked him, no one begged him to stay. The inspector nodded to me, shook Dave's hand, and headed back to his truck. You guys be good, he said. We will, I replied. Dave slapped me on the back. Next time you need lumber dropped off, don't bother calling first, I'll just show up. Won't that cause another incident? I joked. Dave laughed. From who, the ex-president of nothing, Mike raised his mug, to construction zones that actually exist. Greg lifted an invisible glass, to contractors that actually know what they're doing. I looked at my now cone-free lawn, the sun warm on my face, and couldn't help but smile. The HOA had tried to mark my yard as a construction zone to control my life. But in the end, all they really built was the perfect reason to demolish their own tyrant.